In the north, there remained the Lebanese army and the more threatening Syrians. The Lebanese refused battle, and by the last day in October, the Syrians had been vanquished. Galilee was firmly in Israeli hands. Ben-Gurion had been probing for an Arab-Israeli peace move. On January the 13th, 1949, negotiations for an armistice began on the island of Rhodes, conducted by the new United Nations mediator, Dr. Ralph Bunche. An agreement was reached 6 difficult weeks later.
It was with Egypt setting the example that the others followed. It is doubtful whether any of the other countries, Lebanon, Jordan, or Syria, would have had the political clout or the political courage to enter into armistice negotiations with us, even at the behest of the Security Council, if Egypt had not set the example.
These successful armistice negotiations have demonstrated conclusively the ability of the United Nations to mediate a serious conflict and to avert a dangerous threat to the peace.
With United Nations mediation, the young state of Israel and its Arab neighbors conclude an armistice pact, and the victorious Israeli army stages a well-deserved victory parade.
The war for the destruction of Israel's independence had some inevitable effects upon the condition of those Arabs who chose to remain and become citizens of Israel. On the one hand, they had juridical equality. They could elect members to the Knesset. They could, if they wanted, be represented in our parliament at the precise level of their demographic strength. They were equal before the law. On the other hand, their sympathies went out to their kinsmen across the border. But the fact is there was a very great level and a very great sector of normality in the relationship between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. The war that the Arabs launched against Israel created 2 parallel refugee problems. On the one hand, there was the Arab refugee problem, created as a result of the flight of the Arabs from the consequences of the war which their leaders had launched. And on the other side, there were 800,000 Jews in the Arab countries who became refugees because the hatred that was directed against them in those countries made it impossible for them to remain. What is different, however, is the way in which the 2 parties related to their refugee problems. Israel treated the Jewish refugees from Arab countries as citizens, as kinsmen, integrated them into the workforce and into the political system, gave them citizenship as soon as they arrived, and took very strong measures in order to ensure their speedy acceptance into our social and economic framework. The Arabs, on the other hand, regarded the refugees as a political opportunity. They considered, and this prediction was borne out, that if they could keep them in squalor and in misery, in a sense of frustration and desperation, so that their plight would cry out to the conscience of the world, they would thereby alienate Israel from world opinion and create pressure for the entry of those refugees into Israel without peace, that is to say, in conditions in which their entry would create a time bomb.
The issue here is that once you admit that Arab governments launched the war, once you accept the axiom that this refugee problem arose from that war and would not have arisen without it, then you prove by the simplest laws of truth and logic that the Arab governments bear primary responsibility for the creation of this refugee problem. You cannot let loose a war and wash your hands of all responsibility for its tragic consequences.
Those Arabs were there because of right. They are descendants of the very people who lived in Palestine for thousands of years, even before the Jews were there. If some people come from without with a design to occupy their country, to build a state, now where is the responsibility? Whose responsibility is it?
Israel bears no responsibility for a war which it opposed, which it repeatedly yearned to end, and therefore it does not bear the responsibility for the consequences of that war, either for the suffering inflicted by the aggressor in his attack or the defender in his response. We shall do whatever we can earnestly, within the limits of our capacity, to help alleviate the problem which this aggression has caused.
In the Arab world, the rise of a non-Arab state in the heart of the Middle East was seen as a tragedy and a challenge. Stormy protests erupted all over the Arab world, in Baghdad, in Aleppo in North Syria, and in Aden. The far-flung Arab world was in ferment. In 3 days, 80 Jews were killed in Aden and 4 synagogues were burned. In the old communities of Yemen and Iraq, where Jews had lived long before Muslim and Arab history had begun, the rise of a Jewish state was like the sound of a trumpet, calling them to change the direction of their lives and to join in the construction of a new society. Operation Magic Carpet, as it was called, airlifted thousands of Yemenite Jews to Israel, the last of them in September 1950. The biblical prophecy seemed to be fulfilled. The Lord shall set his hand for the second time to recover the remnants of his people, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Until 1950, the attempt to emigrate from Iraq to Israel was a capital offense. Many Jews had been killed there. When the law changed, almost all the Jews applied to leave Iraq, an unfortunate 25,000 elected to remain.
A rescue airlift spans the 600 miles from Baghdad to Tel Aviv to bring to safety 54,000 Jews who face a reported reign of terror in Iraq. Planes running 4 to 6 a day have been getting these refugees out at the rate of 10,000 per month. The rescue must be completed by May 31st, the deadline that Iraq has set for Jewish emigration.
For these Sephardim, their arrival in Israel had profound religious meaning, but there was urgent practical demand caused by what had now become a flood of immigrants. At first, the immigrants were settled in villages evacuated by the Arabs in their flight. They made homes out of ruins. When that space was quickly filled, temporary transit camps had to be thrown together, some from old military bases left by the British. On average, nearly 23,000 newcomers were now arriving every month. Even the paperwork presented an administrative challenge. Tents and huts by the thousands were erected, but at times not fast enough to accommodate the flood of immigrants. By the end of 1949, 100,000 people were living in such transit camps. The Ma'barot were primitive and crowded, flooded by winter rains, exposed to the asperity of the summer heat, and cut off from the main cities and villages. All of Israel's available resources in manpower and material were thrown into the effort to assimilate the new arrivals. The reactions of the new citizens were rewarding. The Ma'bara, or Transition Center, was a unique Israeli experiment designed to encourage immigrants to become independent as soon as they arrived. They were housed in tents or huts, but each family was independent in providing for itself. The government or the Jewish agency provided clinics, dispensaries, schools, unemployment agencies, and the other social services. By the end of 1952, 250,000 new Israelis were living in the Ma'barot. But the system resulted in enforced idleness, not alleviated by improvised schemes. It retarded the integration of the immigrants. The Ma'abarot were also uneconomic. They placed a strain on Israel's meager financial means. New and better answers had to be found.
And then, after a couple of years, not too many, we started taking people out of these transit camps and putting them in places where hopefully, we hope that in days, months, and years to come, they'll start to be productive. So all in all, in the whole country, we built about 500 villages